Most of us are lucky enough to live in countries that are safe and secure, with war being nothing more than a thing we read about online or see on TV. However, around the world, many millions of people live in active war zones, with a shocking 1 in 6 children, or 357 million, living in the midst of armed conflict. What would you do if tomorrow your neighborhood was ground zero for the world's next big conflict? Hello and welcome to another episode of the Infographics Show. Today we're going to take a look at some tips on how to survive in a war zone with zero military training. The Council on Foreign Relations lists 25 major active conflicts in the world today, with 10 of them marked as worsening and only 1 as improving. This may sound pretty bad, but it's actually the best the human race has ever done. The period after the Second World War may have seen the rise of nuclear powers and the threat of global thermonuclear war, but it has in fact been the most peaceful period in recorded history. This is mostly due to the rise of the US and the Soviet Union as global superpowers immediately after World War II. With the rest of the world lining up behind one or the other of these two heavyweights, there wasn't much room for the constant interstate conflict that plagued Europe for thousands of years. Paradoxically, though the world has never been closer to the brink of ultimate destruction, it was exactly that threat of guaranteed global extinction that made everyone behave. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, America quickly moved to create a new world order through a mix of political, financial, and military power. With Theodore Roosevelt's adage fresh in its collective mind, "Speak softly but carry a very big stick," the US sought to create a global trade network that ensured nations would have too much to lose if they decided to pursue war against each other, while simultaneously strengthening NATO and protecting this new age of global trade with the most powerful navy in the world. While conflicts continue today, they are mostly low intensity, and even the US invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan or the Syrian civil war pale in comparison to the full theater wars of yesteryear. With nations trading freely between each other, there's simply too much prosperity at stake for anyone to start pulling the trigger. But armed conflict does still happen, and the relative peace of the last 80 years has no guarantee of lasting forever. So what could you do to survive in a war zone if you have no military training? In order to survive in a war zone, you're going to need to focus on 4 key priorities: food, water, shelter, and security. In the midst of an active war, chances are pretty high that traditional government services are going to collapse, and you'll need to be prepared to fend for yourself and your family. The first priority is food and water. For the first time in history, more people live in cities than live in the countryside, and that means that more people are dependent on an ever-dwindling population of farmers for their food security than ever before. Cities are the nexus of modern civilization and the birthplace of every great technological and cultural revolution. But they are also completely non-self-sufficient and depend on a steady influx of foodstuffs from other agrarian regions. Many cities, such as Los Angeles and Las Vegas, also import the vast majority of their drinking water from far-off sources, which means that in the event of government services shutting down due to war, all that food and water you consume on a daily basis are going to very quickly disappear. Your best option would be to raid a local supermarket and get your hands on non-perishable foodstuffs, such as canned goods and bottled water. A human being needs to drink about 8 8-ounce glasses of water a day, or half a gallon, in order to survive. In an emergency, this can be rationed to about 1/10 of a gallon, though not for very long. Food can stretch even farther. You can survive on average without eating for about 21 days, with your body living off fat reserves. However, cutting out water completely will kill you in 3 days flat. If you happen to be caught in a short-term conflict, you might be able to get by raiding local supermarkets, but your thinking should always be focused on the long term. The best advice thus would be to flee urban areas and head to the countryside. A small freshwater lake should provide enough fishing and game to hunt and ensure survival. Though if you're like the average city slicker, you probably don't have much in the way of survival skills and might find yourself struggling. Practice makes perfect though, and there's no motivator quite like a grumbling stomach. You might, however, be able to locate help from international aid agencies such as the Red Cross. Depending on who is taking part in the conflict you're caught up in, you might actually be able to find some aid from military forces in your area. The United States, for example, often accompanies its armed forces with large amounts of emergency relief personnel and supplies to help people caught in conflict zones. And speaking of the United States, if you're in the US when conflict arises, try to find out the location of the nearest federal emergency response hub. These are typically small to mid-sized airports located in geologically stable and strategically important locations across the country, such as the Bob Hope Airport just outside Los Angeles. These are the locations that U.S. forces and emergency relief personnel are first deployed to and make their home base for ongoing operations, and your best bet to find food, water, and shelter. However, if you're unable to get help from friendly forces, you should be prepared to scrounge for food and water. Unfiltered water can be dangerous to drink, but you can build a homemade water filter pretty easily with materials you can find just about anywhere. Simply take a plastic bag and line the bottom of it with several inches of thoroughly ground up charcoal. Then, put a layer of fine sand between 4 and 6 inches above the layer of charcoal. Place another layer of small rocks on top of the sand, followed by another layer of sand 4 to 6 inches, and yet another small layer of small rocks. Then pour the water onto the top of the bag and cut a very small hole in the bottom of the bag, under the charcoal. While this isn't a foolproof way to purify water, it will limit the amount of impurities and help keep you healthy. Your next priority for surviving a war zone is going to be shelter. Many people simply choose to stay put and let war rage around them. In the midst of World War II, many thousands of people continued to live out their lives amidst the rubble of their bombed-out homes, creating makeshift shelters out of the wreckage. With the advent of smart munitions, there's no need anymore for the mass carpet bombing of the past. But only a small number of nations in the world, to include the US, the UK, Germany, and France, use smart munitions in significant numbers. While, for example, the vast majority of the American arsenal consists of GPS or laser-guided munitions, Russia and China still overwhelmingly rely on dumb and unguided bombs that can indiscriminately target civilians and military targets. Your best bet is to be prepared, and a major ground offensive in your neighborhood could ultimately reduce your home to a bullet-ridden ruin anyway. Staying in large communal groups can be advantageous, as it will help provide shared security. And with a spirit of community, people can help each other out, which increases everyone's odds of survival. However, this can also lead to competition for dwindling resources and might make you a target for armed forces that don't observe modern rules of war and see civilians as fair targets. Once more, fleeing a major population center is in your best interest, in which case you'll likely have to learn to build a makeshift shelter or try to find a smaller community you can take refuge in. If you find yourself forced to build a shelter, the focus should be on ensuring it's watertight and secure against wild animals. A simple lean-to might be enough for the first few days, but eventually you're going to want to start thinking bigger and better. As advanced carpentry skills are out of the question for most people, places such as caves, sewers, or subway tunnels are excellent long-term shelters. Whatever shelter you choose, it should ideally be far away from ongoing conflict, and if possible, have both a main entrance and an emergency exit. You should also take steps to ensure you conceal your presence as best you can, and generally not draw attention to yourself to prevent looters or hostile military patrols from discovering you. Lastly, your final priority is going to be security. Wherever you take shelter and however you find food or water, the most important thing is to remain safe. While most nations obey international rules of war that prevent the deliberate targeting of civilians, you don't want to take any chances. Avoid contact with any military personnel whatsoever if you can help it, unless they are obviously friendly. Especially want to make sure you do not accidentally surprise or stumble upon a military unit out on patrol. With soldiers on high alert against asymmetric threats such as suicide bombers and the like, nothing can be more stressful for a soldier on patrol than stumbling across an unexpected civilian. You should understand that in a soldier's eyes, you represent a significant and unknown threat, and thus if you do accidentally stumble across a patrol, the first thing you should do is show that you are non-threatening. Drop any equipment you are carrying, to include backpacks, and place your hands in the air. If you are armed, place your weapon slowly on the ground with the muzzle pointed away from any military personnel. If possible, remove the magazine from your weapon and expel any rounds in the chamber. Then, once it's on the ground, take several slow steps back away from the weapon. This will signify that you are not a threat and help relieve tension on both sides. Generally, you'll want to avoid being spotted with a weapon by military personnel in an active war zone, as modern urban conflict makes it difficult to tell the difference between combatants and non-combatants, even if they're dressed in civilian attire. With the threat of IEDs, suicide bombers, and ambushes though, military units operating in urban areas are constantly on high alert and under a great deal of stress. You don't want to end up on the wrong end of a jittery soldier's rifle. However, the reality of war is that you will almost certainly need a weapon in order to defend yourself and your family from rogue military forces or looters. If you don't already own a weapon, you'll want to keep your eyes out for an opportunity to grab one. The immediate area after an intense firefight between military forces may be an excellent opportunity to scavenge a rifle. However, it will likely come with great risk. However you acquire a weapon, you'll quickly need to learn how to properly operate it if you don't already have firearms training. Luckily, modern battle rifles around the world are universally simple to operate, and the act of loading and chambering a round is pretty intuitive as soon as you get your hands on one. Aiming, however, is a bit trickier, and it's not as simple as you might see in the movies. To properly aim, you'll want to press your cheek firmly against the buttstock of the rifle and gently lay your face down until your eye comes down level with the rear metal sight. Looking through the rear sight, you'll then want to place the front sight post directly in the center of the rear sight. This will ensure your rifle is level. Then, simply place the front sight post over your target while keeping it centered within the rear sight, and shift your focus from your target to the very tip of the front sight post. Your intended target should go blurry, but the very tip of your front sight post should be in perfect, sharp focus. Then, gently squeeze the trigger. Surviving in a war zone is the most difficult challenge a human being can face, yet many manage to do just that every day. While you should thank your lucky stars that you're one of the lucky millions that live in relative peace and safety, it doesn't hurt to be prepared. So what would be your survival strategy in a war zone? What kind of war might happen in your home country? Let us know in the comments. Also, be sure to check out our other video, What Would It Take to Sink USS Gerald R. Ford Aircraft Carrier? Thanks for watching, and as always, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. See you next time.